So in the last talk, we heard about that it was a bit academic or something. This is going to be much more academic. We're going to be talking about things that don't exist, yet maybe ever. Yeah. So my name is Lukas. I'm a PhD student at Graz, University of Technology, with him.
With me.
Yeah.
I'm Daniel Gruss, and I also have been at RuhrSec before. Actually, I also think I only missed one that was in person. And some of the slides, you might remember them from my first talk at RuhrSec, because there I also talked about caches and cache attacks. And for the basics, there will be some parts that are similar. So I should start right away, I think.
Sure.
CPU caches are a shared resource. Caches, they exist in all our computers. And the problem is if we have a cache, you probably know this from the movie Inception, like this sentence, don't think of elephants. Now I pulled the picture of an elephant into many heads here in this room. And this is caching. Now it's right in your, readily available in your brain. And for a computer, this also exists. If I send a request to memory, then it will be pulled into the caches and it will be readily available for further operations. And this is a side channel, because now I know that when I access it again, it will be there right away, much faster. So a side channel. Cache side channels are very powerful because they always are there when you access memory. And when we work with data, maybe secret data, we always work with memory because we can't fit all of that into registers. So cache side channels are simple, they are fast, they are reliable. We have seen many attacks there. For instance, cross-VM key recoveries. We have seen Spectre and Meltdown that also rely on cache attacks internally. Zombie load, maybe.
But do Spectre and Meltdown actually need cache attacks?
Well, the thing is, Spectre and Meltdown are microarchitectural effects, and they exploit something called transient execution. And it's difficult to get information from this transient execution window to the normal world.
So the cache is just really nice for attacking things microarchitecturally.
They are a nice side channel that you can use there, but you could probably use other techniques as well.
Okay. So we'll start by trying to get rid of that side channel first.
So in this talk, we will first give an overview of existing designs, some existing designs, not all of them, right? Because that would be too much. Some traditional caches, we will categorize them broadly and then examine some of these designs more specifically. Yeah, and then we will also give an outlook on what we expect to happen in the future, including some of our own work. So how do modern caches work? As I said, we access a memory location, like here. We first get a cache miss because it's not in the cache. We pull it from the DRAM back into the cache. Now it's in the cache. The second time we access it, we get a cache hit. So first a cache miss, that is slow because it goes to DRAM. Second one, a cache hit, that's no DRAM access, that's much faster. And you can see this in timing, and this is the part that I really like. If you give this to a bachelor student, an undergraduate student, and tell them, okay, please distinguish cache hits and cache misses. They don't even need the statistics classes for that, because here are the cache hits, here are the cache misses. There are no cache misses below, I would say, 175. That's a simple threshold. Everyone can do that. Put a threshold there and say, oh, those were the cache hits, here are the cache misses. And this is, 10 to the 7. You can see that really most of the cases are around those timing blocks. How does a cache work? This is a set associative cache design. You have the memory address here. You have some usage of the bits, the lowest B bits for the offset within a cache line, the middle N bits to index the cache, to find the right cache set. And a cache set then exists of multiple such ways, and each way has a tag and some data associated. Yeah, and then you use the remaining bits to compute this tag and check whether the tag matches, and if so, you can return the data to the user. And of course, replacement policies will be relevant there, and they also have some security implications. But before we talk about that, we want to talk about attacks, simple attacks on these caches. Or maybe not that simple, but techniques that are quite important. So prime and probe is a very generic technique. You can apply that to many cache-like structures and buffers. And it pretty much works like this. You have some attacker address space, some memory locations there, and the attacker wants to attack this victim, and there are some locations the attacker wants to know if the victim accesses those. And the attacker, to get there, the attacker will fill one of these cache sets with all of its own memory locations.
Generically, we might call this an eviction set, right?
Yes, we call this an eviction set. And now if the victim tries to access one of those addresses, it has to kick something out of the cache. It has to evict something itself. It will do that, load the data maybe here. And if the attacker later on tries to re-access its own data, the eviction set, then the attacker will see that, oh, this was fast, this was slow, and it will continue like that. And the attacker will see that re-accessing the eviction set is slower because some of its lines were kicked out of the cache. The cache hierarchy today, of course, is a bit more complex than this simple block of memory with cache sets. Today you have multiple cores, you have multiple L1 caches. They are usually private, which means that one core can only access its own L1 cache, but not the L1 cache of another core. The same goes for the L2 caches. And then we have the last level cache, the L3 cache. And on some CPUs, this is connected via ring bus. It could also be a mesh, depending on the CPU architecture. There are also some CPUs that skip the L2 layer and just have here the last level cache right away after the L1. And on Intel CPUs, this is typically divided into slices. Also there are different designs, but we will focus on the slice one here. The interesting attacks that we have here are then cross-core attacks, where one workload is running on one core, the attacker workload, and the other, the victim workload, is running on another core. And you would think, oh, they are running on separate CPU cores, so they are isolated. But because of this shared last level cache, attacks are still possible. And that gets us to secure cache designs. So this was maybe 2015, 2016, we realized, oh, this is really a big problem. And then people started, saying, we need secure cache designs for the last level cache, because so far there weren't any that were applicable for the last level cache. So let's start doing that. And we focus here on mainly two directions that cover, it's broad categories that cover a lot of the designs in this space. The one direction is partition-based, the other is randomization-based. And we will start with partition-based here.
And so not to leave anything out, there are technically some other designs that don't quite fit in these, but we're not going to be talking about them today.
Okay, so partitioning-based designs. The idea of partitioning is that you want to avoid that attacker and victim share a cache line or cache set in the cache. And that's usually very difficult if you have shared memory. So that's why we just say, let's ignore the problem of shared memory. Problems of futures. So let's focus on non-shared memory for now. Shared libraries are complicated. And then there are actually some solutions, for instance, compiler extensions or code diversification approaches that work on the software level during the compilation step, for instance, to make sure that no cache lines of two different processes of two different security domains land in the same cache set. And one very early approach, actually also one of these, is cache coloring. Coloring is very simple because you have this mapping here from n bits in the middle, the cache index, to those sets. Now, if you would make sure that the selection of these addresses or the assignment of these addresses during compilation or while loading the program, that you only hand out addresses to one security domain there that all have the same n bits here in the middle, then you would have sort of like a color in the cache. You can color the cache lines, and here this address would then maybe the color yellow, and the next one has a different color. And so you assign one color to one security domain, or you can assign multiple colors even and say, well, this workload can use multiple of these colors, but you make sure that two separate workloads that are not mutually trusted, that they get different colors, and therefore they don't see any interaction in the cache there. Cache coloring is a bit limited, though. If you think of an L1 cache, for instance, you have 4 kilobyte pages in your system, and 4 kilobyte pages, one page maps to 64 indices, because you have 64 byte cache lines. L3 caches typically have something like 2048 to 4096 sets per slice, and that means also there each 4 kilobyte page covers 64 of these indices there. And if you now only hand out 4 kilobyte pages that have the same color, so that then you would, for the L3 for instance, generate 32 to 64 different colors, and you can, with that, isolate workloads. You can also modify the compiler if you want to focus on the L1 cache. You can modify the compiler to also only use 64 byte regions of the same color. Then you get way more colors even. Why wouldn't you do that? Because you are actually not using your entire cache anymore. You're restricting your workload to a very small subset maybe of the cache, and that's inefficient usage of resources and a big performance penalty. So maybe you don't want to do that. And then there are some other designs, and I will just go briefly through them. We have, for instance, a NOMO cache, the non-monopolizable cache that was proposed, and there the idea is that in every cache set you have, and this is an L1 cache, we are in one core, 2 threads of one core with SMT, that each thread gets one cache line that cannot be monopolized by the other thread. And that means if the attacker fills the cache set maybe with these yellow cache lines, it cannot fill this one, and the victim, if it loads a cache line, it will go there. And the attacker, if the attacker tries to evict it, it doesn't work, it's not allowed, because it's a NOMO way, non-monopolizable way. There is also another design I want to mention here, the dynamically allocated way guard, or short DOG. And it uses 2 bit masks also to control which ways can be evicted and which ways hide hits. So there the idea is if the attacker already controls some part of the cache set and the victim now loads some data, it will be included in the cache because of some inclusiveness property of the cache. And then if the attacker tries to evict it, it doesn't work because it's protected via this bit mask. And if the attacker tries to access it, the attacker will also see a cache miss because it's protected by the other bit mask. Yeah. So this is about partitioning and with explicit partitions. There are also further designs, for instance, the partition lock cache, but also Intel cut. Intel cut is something that you already find in processors. You will find Intel cut especially in server processors. And there the idea is also you have the last level cache and you want to split it so that different partitions don't see each other. And typical splits are then maybe that you assign 25% of the cache to one domain and then 75% to another, or maybe half and half, something like that. It depends a bit on the processor, what is supported, and what you can do there. But you really split the cache, and then they are isolated, these workloads. There was recently, after more advanced side channel attacks, cache side channel attacks, we had really this sparked a wave of new cache designs, and also some in this wave are hype cache. And hype cache had the idea that in every cache you just add a fully associative subcache, and this fully associative subcache, the fully associativeness has a nice property that you don't know if you evict this fully associative cache, you don't know which element it actually was within that. So it sort of hides what was going on.
Why don't you know what's different there?
Yeah, for the other one, you had one set, and if you have an eviction set for that one set, you know exactly the attacker knows exactly that the victim accessed something in that set. Where you
because it's only one of 8 addresses or something.
Yes, and in this case, it's way more addresses, and you don't have any correlation with the address anymore, because right, on the y-axis we had this correlation with the index that is based on the address. With this, we eliminate that. We don't have any relation to the address anymore. So we really lose a lot of information with this fully associativeness. And here the idea is to just have a small fraction of the cache acting like fully associative cache, and isolate the workloads with that. Another design that is also very recent is chunked cache, and there the split is in the other dimension. There they don't say, well, let's split the ways apart, but let's split the sets apart. And here the idea is that one domain gets the first half of the sets maybe, and then a second one gets the next quarter, and maybe the last quarter is still unallocated. But then if the victim or if another isolated domain is created, then this is also used by this isolated domain. And again, they don't see each other in the cache because they map to different locations. And that means the attacker cannot evict the victim domain. And this gets us to randomized caches.
Which is where I will take over.
Yeah?
Thank you. Okay. So all these partition caches, as Daniel said in the very beginning, they have this nice property, they're cut off. And so the security is usually pretty good. If you can't get to the other half, we don't need to really talk about security. But we lose performance. And so for randomized caches, the idea is that we keep the size, but we make it harder to infer which addresses were accessed. So in 2015, Lou and colleagues found a new function-agnostic evictions, new strategy to generate eviction sets without knowing what the cache looks like. And in response to that, Qureshi published a Caesar paper. And then 1 year later, he and Vila and colleagues found a break for that type of cache because they improved the strategy for finding eviction sets. And just a bit later, there were several proposed skewed randomized caches that can cope with even those attacks. So for example...
Oh. Sorry.
Maybe turn yours off?
Yeah, maybe I turn mine off.
Sorry. Yeah, so we'll go through 2 of these, Qureshi and Werner and colleagues, and the colleagues are us. Yeah, and then, just a bit later, there was another paper, the colleagues again are us, that showed even faster eviction and kind of breaks those before. So we can start to see a pattern here. And then lastly, we have a new generation that aren't broken yet, and we're going to look at those as well. Okay, so let's jump in. So for scatter cache, we had this idea that if the problem is that it's very easy to go from this index function here directly to an entire set, and so it's very easy to construct these eviction sets, why don't we construct something a lot more complicated? Okay, let's look at that in detail. So instead of using just an index, we also use a tag, which is the majority or the rest of the address. So now we use the entire address except for the offset. And we put that into something we call an index derivation function. So this is some cryptographic primitive, like karma, for example. And then we key that. And we also add a domain here as a key. And then what we get out are indices into the cache that are unique for each domain and address. So for example, where I said before, can you see the pointer? No, okay, not at all. Maybe I should go here.
You can take this one.
Is that better? Okay. So before we would have, a set would have been just one straight line here, where these are the banks. And now we construct these custom sets basically for each address. Yeah, and the security now depends on the hardware key and the security domain, so that can be processes or virtual machines. Yeah. So this is what it would have looked like before. You just have these fixed static sets, set 1 to whatever, and then in our new design, for each address, you get a completely randomized set. So the same address would have 2 very different cache patterns for 2 different domains, and another address, a completely different pattern again. Right. So this means, well, we start out with the unshared memory. We have no shared cache lines. And all of these fancy attacks that we haven't told you about, but you're going to have to believe me, they are even better than prime probe. These don't work on unshared memory. And for shared memory, this cache design makes it such that it behaves like unshared memory, because now we can have copies of shared memory in the cache. Right. And without OS support, it's just a bit harder. That's suboptimal. Okay. So at the time, we already knew that specialized prime probe variants would still work, because there is still overlap in the cache sets, but it's now really hard to get a full overlap. So we'd expect usually one line to overlap between an address in the attacker and an address in the victim. And so this turns it probabilistic. And so now if we want to evict a certain address in a victim, we'll suddenly need 275 addresses just to evict an 8-way cache, or one set in an 8-way cache, or one address. And before that would have been just 8, and those 8 would have been very easy to find. And so at the time, we calculated that this set construction would need 2 to the power of 25 profiled victim accesses, and not just attacker accesses, as opposed to maybe 100 that you'd need before. So we thought that was pretty good security. And a similar design by Koeshi had also this idea that they take the normal address and they put it into 2 different encryption functions, and then those map to 2 different halves of a set, and then you randomly choose between them. And they had a strong focus on rekeying that you can see here. So every so many accesses, this mapping here, this key would change, and then your address moves somewhere else. And the idea is that profiling, if you can't finish the profiling within 1 period of rekeying, then all the work you did is useless now. And so they calculated that with 0.1% rekeying, which means changing the location of only 1 line every 1,000 accesses, that'd be only a vulnerability window of about 1 millisecond every 68 years. Mm-hmm. Also sounds pretty good.
But overall, this design is still very similar to scatter cache, just that it uses the rekeying.
Exactly, and a few people noticed that, but we're going to come to that a bit later. Mm-hmm. So we're going to stay with Caesar and CaesarS for just a second. So complicated crypto, all the cryptographers in the audience enjoy, but you don't need to understand that. The important part is Caesar and CaesarS use a custom low-latency block cipher. This 4-stage Feistel network here. And this is linear in the entire cipher. And so those of you that learned about that might already have alarm bells going off. So that means that a difference at the input can propagate all the way to the output. And that allows us to construct eviction sets entirely offline without ever touching the cache. And even if it's rekeyed, those set relations stay exactly the same. So I can use the same set with a new key on the victim address, and basically the entire construction is bypassed. And so the conclusion here is, like you've probably been taught, don't do custom cryptography. So now to the commonality that you may have noticed in the 2 designs before. Some people noticed. Poinard and colleagues, again, colleagues are us, Song and Bourgeot and colleagues. And they also came up with new attacks, as I said before, that then drastically reduced the attack time on those improved cache designs. So let's look at ours here, the Poinard and us. So we built this generic model that includes all of those other cache designs, where we now take some part of the address, put it into some function here, and then map that to a number of P partitions between which we randomly decide. And then within the partition, for example, with these 2 ways, you can still have LRU or something like a normal cache. And this function here can build or map onto the standard caches, current standard caches, and scatter cache, Caesar, and also phantom cache, if you know it. And the way it does that is, for example, for building LRU, all we need to do is make that just a pass-through of the index, make P 1 partition, and then we have a normal cache again. And scatter cache is on the other side of that, where P is, say, 8 for an 8-way cache. And this is a cryptographic function. And then you get 8 indices, and then that's your set. All right. So and within that paper, we developed a generic attack that works for all cache designs that fit into this pattern. So it's called prime, prune, and probe. We start priming by accessing a certain amount of addresses k, usually larger than 1. That can be maybe half the cache or 2/3 the cache, something that should fit into the cache. And in the pruning step, we now measure the time that it takes to access them, and then we'll discover if we've had self-evictions when we populated this set. And if we have no self-evictions, then we move to the next step, and if we have some, then we start again. So we access them again and again, and this starts to coalesce the set into the cache, and if it does fit, then we'll have a set that fills a good chunk of the cache and doesn't self-evict. And if we don't get there, we start removing addresses and making a bit smaller. So once we have that, we can trigger one victim access. And so, for example, if we have 2/3 of the entire cache, then we have 2/3, a probability of 66% to notice to see collision here. And then we've found one address from our eviction set. So this sounds complicated, but it's better than what we had before.
But this changes how eviction works. So that means some of the numbers and estimates we had before maybe are not correct anymore?
Maybe a bit off. Yeah. So that's nice. Okay, so for scatter cache, for a certain case, for small victim application, we found that this reduces the profiling time by 3 orders of magnitude.
But that's our own. Can you talk about some caches by someone else?
Okay. Sorry, break someone else's work. Okay. So for CZ2, the variant we showed before with 2 partitions, we saw that where before we had 68 years, coincidentally we now find that 68% of each rekeying interval is actually attackable. So yeah, at that rekeying interval, not great. For 1% rekeying, we found that it's mostly resistant. So we've already reduced the margins significantly. And for the S4 configuration, where CISA has 4 partitions instead of 2, we find that we reduced by 20 orders of magnitude. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so be careful with your assumptions about what an attacker can do.
But maybe we can build something better, a better cache than those.
Yeah, some people have tried. They haven't failed yet.
Okay, so which ones are those?
Yeah, let's see. So we're going to start with Mirage. This one is complicated, sorry. The idea is that we can, that all of these attacks attack cache sets. And so if we get rid of them, what do we attack? So the idea is to get somewhere into the vicinity of a fully associative cache that Daniel talked about before. But the problem is here, the cache could have 200,000 cache lines. And if our address could be anywhere, then for each cache access, we would need to search 200,000 cache lines. And that's
way too expensive.
Yeah, way too much power, not a good idea. And so they had the idea of emulating this probabilistically by doing some kind of load balancing. So let's look at this. Okay, complicated. We start again with 2 functions, 2 hash cryptographic functions. That's like scatter cache or like Caesar. And then they each point to one of these sets. Now they're tag sets. And now the special part here is that we over-provision this, which means if we want to have an 8-way cache, then we have 4 here, 4 here, but we also have some extra space here.
Space that you don't actually use?
Well, we use it sometimes, and that's the point. So when we now insert something, we'll pick one of these functions, and we'll pick the one that has fewer in there. So we choose by load. So here we have already 4, we have only 3. And then this balances out nicely. And each time we insert something new, we remove a random line from the entire cache. And so what this achieves is that each of these sets will actually never overflow. And the overflow is what we need to profile or to generate these eviction sets. Because we will never know if our address maps to this set unless we see a spillover here. So, or rather, we won't know if 2 addresses conflict in a set if we can never see a spillover. And the way they worked it out is that they can guarantee security beyond the lifetime of the universe. We'll
According to the paper.
Yeah, maybe land next year, we don't know. Or maybe it won't. We can be hopeful. Okay. Daniel will.
Yeah, there are more cache designs actually. One that I wanted to mention here as well is clepsydra cache. Also basically a secure cache design similar to the other ones that we've seen, randomized cache. But they introduce something that is called a time to live for each cache line. And they have a rate with which the time to live decreases. And if you have a conflict in the cache, as illustrated in red here, then this rate with which the cache lines age goes up, so the cache lines age faster, and then they are kicked out when their time to live reaches 0. So again, things are kicked out of the cache without the attacker or the victim doing anything for that. And with this effect, if the attacker triggers a lot of conflicts, which the attacker has to do to observe victim activity, then the time to live would go down very quickly and the attacker wouldn't be able to observe anything about the victim. Yeah. And we also came up with some new design there, and you want to talk about that now, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
So we thought if at first you don't succeed, make it more complicated. So our new cache, scatter and split securely, is going to be published hopefully sometime soon. We'll see. And maybe you notice it looks similar to scatter cache, but now we have introduced into this index derivation function 2 sub-functions. So we have a generation layer that generates an intermediate value, and then a spacing layer that spaces to the final indices, and then that works the same. So we use these indices to create our cache set for an address. So a difference that you may notice here is that some of these are white. And that's because with this design, some parts of the cache can never be reached by a specific domain.
So you don't use part of the cache?
Sadly not, but that's a trade-off. So that's something like partitioning that we've introduced here, but cryptographically. All right, let's look at this in a bit more detail. Okay, so in this first stage, generate immediate. We use again the key, the address, we put them in a block cipher. And then
Which block cipher do you use there?
A custom one.
Didn't you just say you shouldn't design custom crypto?
Oh, no, it's fine. We used a world-class cryptographer to slightly modify a very well-started cipher, which is Karma. So I'm sure this one will be fine.
Okay.
Yeah. You can trust us. We haven't messed up yet. Okay. So with this first layer, we generate these indices again, and we can just cut them out from the output. And that's the same as scatter cache. And now we add the second layer, where each of the indices gets its own block cipher. We put in, say, 10 bits here or 11 bits here, and we take out 11 bits. And the point is not to make it more random, but because we only put in 11 bits of information here, we get out less than those 11 bits here, because these 11 bits are spread over this entire thing. So that works out to about 63%. So normally 11 bits would map to 2048, but we only get about 1290. So this basically spaces it out over the cache. Okay, yeah, and then we address again.
But
okay.
This construction, you can configure it a bit, right? Yeah, you're talking about that.
Well, okay, so this gives us the notion of configurable coverage. So if we go back again, we could, for example, change this here of 11 bits to 11 bits to 10 bits to 11 bits. And suddenly our coverage, or part of the share of the cache, is 39%. So let's look at this from a different perspective. Each domain with the spacing layer has access to a part of a bank. So this would be normally 1,000 addresses represented by 10 here. And so the part that we would have access to, 63%, are now here 6. And if we now add a second domain, an attacker domain, we get a security notion. So this second domain also has access to 6 of these ways, but they only overlap in 3. So already we can maybe see, if we don't have access to all of these, maybe attacking will get a bit harder. All right, so blown up to all the sets for all the ways for a 16-way cache. It would look something like this. Each of these banks has its own pattern because there's different function beneath each of them. And we'd select a set something like this. Then we can see that this set, for example, even in those 3 examples, does not have overlap in all of them. And so we get a certain probability that a victim line can even be reached by an attacker in full. So no matter what an attacker does, they may not be able to reach all of the ways a victim line can go into.
So it is not possible anymore to evict the victim.
Exactly, once it's in that line. So for 63%, for each line, that's 0.06%. And maybe that's too much for you because you need, I don't know, every 1,000 addresses you have a good chance to have an overlap. So let's make it 39%. And at that point, it becomes pretty unlikely that we find overlap.
And that means only this many addresses remain attackable. What does it mean they remain attackable? They get the same security level there as a typical secure randomized cache. They still get that.
I want a caveat, at least for the attacks we know about. Okay. So this first layer provides this catacache security. The second layer provides resistance against profiling. Because with profiling with prime probe before, we've seen we need repeated observations. And so when we do repeated observations, we need to evict the victim repeatedly. And that then, at some point, puts them in one of the cache lines that the attacker just cannot access, and then it can't evict them anymore, and then the whole game is over. You can't continue profiling, and yeah, that's the idea, basically. And so we see that for these configurations, say for 39%, after only about 6 victim observations, we're almost at 0 probability that it's not in an inaccessible way. Right. And even the improved version that we know about still needs a lot of victim accesses, certainly more than somewhere below 10. Okay.
Yeah, and then all the attacks are impossible and we're done. Great.
Yeah.
So maybe let's take a look ahead.
Yeah. So we've seen this pattern.
It's
an attacker finds something, defender does something better, and
cat and mouse game.
Yeah, exactly.
We all know, yeah. But it will continue probably as a cat and mouse game until someone finds a cache design that really solves everything once and for all.
Maybe one of the last 3 or some of the partitioned are already perfectly secure.
Well, we had some cases where it said 100 years security or security until the end of the universe, and then the 100 years later on turned out to be 5 seconds.
And so I guess the last question is, will we ever see that in real CPUs?
Yeah, but I guess we have to ask Intel there. And AMD. Is anyone here from Intel?
You want to build something like this? We've heard it's harder to build than it is to write a paper about it. But we aren't sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so that was our outlook on secure cache designs. Thank you.